Hi, I'm Kurt Loder with an MTV News special report on a very sad day. Kurt Cobain, the leader of one of rock's most gifted and promising bands, Nirvana, is dead, and this is the story as we know it so far.
That's right, folks. It is April 2024, which means on this episode, we are going to be talking about all of the shit that I care to talk about from April 1994. Now, obviously, before anything else, the big thing that happened in my world and a lot of people's worlds in April of 1994 was the death of Kurt Cobain. No need to go into any of the details here, but he died on April 5th, and then it was reported to the public after he was discovered, and I believe that was April 8th. I don't know if that was the same day he was discovered, but that's the day that we all found out about it. Now, at the time, I remember having very conflicting emotions because I was at school and I guess the news came out in the afternoon or something. And I remember like somebody coming over to me and being like, hey, did you hear that Kurt Cobain died? And at this point, it was this thing where a couple months prior, he had an overdose and they were already I remember there was rumors that he had died and then he didn't, he was fine. It was just this thing where it was seeming depressingly inevitable that something bad was going to happen to him. Now, for somebody like me, 3 years prior in 1991, when I first heard Nevermind and I discovered Nirvana, they were a really big deal. They still are a very big deal to me. But at the time, they pretty much changed my life musically with my outlook of what I could do and be musically. And so they were very important. And I didn't quite know how important yet. But in 1994, I did know that it seemed like there were too many other people that were claiming the shit that was mine. You know, you're 16 years old, which I was at the time, and you didn't really know how to handle your emotions. And it was around that time that you would get bummed out when people that seemed really uncool were into the shit that meant something to you. And so by 1994, there were a lot of quote unquote uncool people who were all about Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. And so I just remember having very conflicting emotions because I wanted to be like, who the fuck cares? But then I remember going home in the evening and being pretty depressed about it and just being like, what is that like when you decide to end your life? Which you can argue that to death if you want, but we're not going to do that here. But not only was it the first like death of somebody in the public that was important to me, but the first suicide. And so it was really emotionally interesting for me at the time, to say the least. But whether or not he would continue to do music in some shape or form, or if Nirvana would have continued or broken up and come back, who the fuck knows? We didn't get any of that. The story ended right there. And part of me feels like that's kind of a good thing, which is really weird. Anyway, not to drone on and on about this, but it was a big deal at the time. And if it was for you too, then you know what I'm talking about here. But to me, he's an important figure in my life. And honestly, the image of him in my head will always be the very first Nirvana picture I ever saw on the inside of Nevermind. And I just remember seeing him and thinking, man, he looks cool as fuck. I want to be cool as fuck like that. And so that's how I always remember Kurt Cobain. And yeah. You can argue whether or not they were a good band or what the fuck ever. It doesn't matter. They were a great band to me, and he was an important musician to me. And we lost him 30 years ago this month. Let's move on to happier news, because also in April of 1994, I, as a 16-year-old young head, got to go to my very first legit concert. On April 22nd, I went to the Terrace in Austin, Texas to see Tool with the Flaming Lips and Failure. Now, this was Tool on the tour for Undertow at the time. So they were, a fairly new band, and they obviously hadn't become the big deal that they are now, but they were a big deal to me. I fucking love that album. I really loved that album at the time. Way back when I began the Old Head thing, and it was just a podcast at the beginning of 2019, I think. Anyway, I did an entire episode where I talked about my experience at that show. So I'm not going to go on and on about that here. I'm going to put a link to that episode that you can listen to on YouTube and hear the entire story. But that happened 30 years ago this month in April 1994. All right, moving on to the top albums of the month in April 1994. For the first week of April, the number one album in the country was Ace of Base with The Sign. This is not something that I was into at the time, nor have I ever been into it, but it was popular. But for the second week of April, an album that I was very much into became the number one album in the country, and that was Pantera with Far Beyond Driven. Quite possibly the heaviest album ever to become number one in the country. It has to be. And honestly, that kind of shows you, how big heavy rock music still was around that time. Now, mind you, by the next week, it wasn't number one anymore, and apparently it fell way the fuck down the charts. But, everybody came out on that week to support metal, and it was a beautiful thing. And then for the third week of April 1994, the number one album in the country was Bonnie Raitt with Longing in Their Hearts. I think there's a song off this that was a hit that I remember, but it's not coming to mind right now. And then moving quickly to the fourth week of April 1994, the number one album in the country was Pink Floyd with The Division Bell. And that was, I think, the second album that they did without Roger Waters. I remember kind of liking it at the time, but I don't think I've listened to it again since 1994. But yeah, I mean, we got some rock and some metal in the top albums of the country, and that's not a thing that happens anymore. All right, moving on to the cinema. The number one movie in the country for the first week of April 1994 was Major League 2. Charlie Sheen. I don't think I saw Major League 2. I saw the first one, and I remember enjoying it. But for some reason, Major League 2 was not anything that was on my radar of a thing I was interested in. So I don't know anything about it. For the second week of April, this movie was number one for a week in the last month, I believe, as well. D2, The Mighty Ducks. Another one that I have not seen. I'm sure if you're new to the channel, you're like, why are you even fucking talking about this? You don't know anything about it. Hey, I'm just presenting the stats, people. Because you can be sure as fuck I didn't see the movie that was number one the third week of April. 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Hugh Grant? I feel like 4 Weddings and a Funeral is the movie that kicked off shit rom-coms. Am I right? Maybe it was When Harry Met Sally. Either way, it just seemed like there was a few movies that came out that were successful, and then all of a sudden that genre is just a thing that certain people enjoy. And I guess you like what you like, whatever. I have so little time that I devote to movies and things like that is not anything I'm ever going to go near. And for the fourth week of April 1994, the number one movie in the country was Bad Girls. And it was an all-female Western. I think I've seen this. Honestly, my biggest memory of this one is that I had a really good friend at the time that was very into the movie, mostly because he was very into Drew Barrymore. But that's it. It's Western. It's got ladies in it. Number one movie for a week. There you go. All right, moving on to the album releases for April of 1994. On April 8th, the album Smash from The Offspring. I think this is the third Offspring album, and this is the one, it fucking blew up. And I think at the time, it was the biggest selling punk or independent label album. It may still be, because this is on Epitaph, which is not... I think they have major label distribution, so it's cheating a little bit, but they're technically an indie label. But this is the only Offspring album of my own. I enjoy things on the first 2 as well, but then they kind of fell off for me in a big way. But this one I have a lot of nostalgia for, just because it kind of sounds like high school to me. But yeah, great album, Offspring, Smash. All right, April 12th, we have 3 big releases to talk about. First off, The Bleeding from Cannibal Corpse came out. Now, as usual, this cover is great. It's the zoomed out cover. It's the cover that was painted for the album, but I just prefer this. I don't know why. I prefer it. I don't know. But this was a big deal because I was into Cannibal Corpse, and when this album came out, I just thought it blew every death metal album ever made out of the water. It's still one of my favorites of all time. Last album with Chris Barnes on vocals, who would leave, get fired, both and go on and join 6 Feet Under. But at the time, it was a very big deal for me, and it still is. Also released on April 12th, 1994, Live Through This from Hole, the second Hole album. And so the last album we just talked about, Cannibal Corpse, The Bleeding, and Live Through This from Hole, there's a funny connection for those two albums for me, but I'm not going to talk about it here. I'm going to send you over to Old Head Radio on Live 365. On the Old Head Radio show, I'm going to be playing songs from both of those albums and telling the little story about the funny connection. That episode premieres this Friday, April 5th at 8 p.m. Central. You can go to my link tree in the description and get the link to Old Head Radio, which is like 24 hours of Old Head approved music. But if you can't make it to the 8 o'clock premiere of the episode, it repeats Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. Central. And then for the rest of the month, every weekend, 8 Central on Fridays, 2 p.m. Central on Saturdays. So check it out. It's a lot of fun. I'm actually getting to do radio shows exactly the way I want to do them. But yes, Hole, Live Through This. I liked the album a lot at the time. It hasn't aged very well for me. I actually prefer the first album over this one, but it's still got some bangers on it. So there you go. And also released on April 12th, 1994, Wait from the Rollins Band. Fucking amazing album. This one's seen a little bit of action. This is, I was just lucky to find an affordable copy of this album because this album is on Imago Records. Can you see that? And that's a label that was completely fucked and completely fucked their artists. And so who knows if this is ever going to get a proper vinyl release. So I'll take it with all the blemishes. But this album is great. I don't like it as much as The End of Silence, the album before, but there's so many great songs on this. Plus, their biggest hit, Liar, is on this album as well. But it's just a shitload of bangers, and I love Rollins, and I love the Rollins Band. Last but not least, skipping forward to April 26, 1994, the first album from Outkast, Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music. Did I say that right? Our introduction to Outkast, one of the greatest hip-hop groups ever. We did a Cranked and Ranked and a Slashed and Mashed for Speakerbox The Love Below. And you can go watch those somewhere on my channel. But this is not my favorite Outkast album by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a lot of fun. And every amazing group starts somewhere, and Outkast started right there. Not an incredibly exciting month, but I'm not quite done with you yet. Who wants to go back another 10 years? April 1984. I was 6 years old at the time. Some of the music I talk about in these segments I heard and was into at the time, and some, like this album, I did not hear till years later, but it's the only album that I have to talk about for April of 1984. On April 12th, Grace Under Pressure from Rush. I think this is the most underrated Rush album, in my opinion. It's moving into the synthy stuff. Obviously with Signals, they already kind of really leaned into that, and this is that a little bit more, but there are just so many great songs, and I love the production on this album. And also, come on, look at that band photo. Is that the best band photo of Rush ever? I think it is. I don't remember where this album fell in my Rush ranking, but it had to have at least been in the top 10 because I absolutely love it. And this came out in April of 1984, Grace Under Pressure. All right, that's it. Another trip down memory lane, and I appreciate you all coming with me. Of course, as usual, I will be back next month to talk about all of the shit from May 1994 and 84. I mean, I don't know, maybe we'll get to a month where nothing I want to talk about came out in 84, but I'm gonna keep digging for you guys because you're worth it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all again next month.